She spent 15 years buying Caravans instead of saving, now she wants me to pay for her dog. She texts you out of nowhere, no real ask, just enough words to make you feel guilty if you do nothing. And you have been here before. You have been here your entire life. That one sentence, that one carefully worded, perfectly constructed guilt trip, landed exactly the way she intended it to. But this time, something was different. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story does not start with a dog. This story does not even start with a text. This story starts with a childhood, and with the particular kind of damage that gets done to a kid who is never allowed to just be a kid. Growing up, this woman was not just struggling. She was choosing. There is a difference, and that difference matters enormously when you are trying to understand why our narrator felt absolutely nothing when that text came through. She would ask her kids, her actual children, for money to buy alcohol. Not food. Not utilities. Alcohol. Picture what that moment looks like from a child's perspective. You have birthday money in your hand, or maybe pocket money you have been carefully saving for something small and exciting, and the adult who is supposed to be protecting you is standing there with her hand out, not because the electricity is about to be cut off, not because there is nothing in the fridge, but because she wants a drink. That is not a hard time. That is a transaction. She let their teeth rot because dental care was not on her list of priorities, because taking a child to the dentist requires scheduling and follow-through and a basic acknowledgement that your child's body is your responsibility. And birthday money, the one thing that was supposed to belong to the kids, the one small pocket of joy and ownership they had, something that a grandparent or an aunt or a family friend gave specifically and deliberately to that child, she took that too. We are not talking about a parent who hit hard times and made difficult calls. We are talking about a pattern of behavior so consistent, so deliberate, so unapologetically repeated, that it followed this family across decades. And then she got married. You might think, okay, fresh start, new chapter, things change. But they did not change. She kept working 1 day a week. 1. Not because she was ill, not because she had some documented condition that prevented her from holding down a job, but by choice. Her words, by choice. And look, there is nothing inherently wrong with a household where one partner works less, if the household can actually support that arrangement. But this one could not. The household did not have disposable income, and yet somehow, they found the money for a full backyard renovation. Think about what a backyard renovation actually involves. Contractors. Materials. Landscaping. Planning. Weeks or months of organized spending toward a purely aesthetic goal. They financed a second car. They bought a caravan. A caravan. That is not a necessity. That is not keeping the lights on. That is a luxury purchase that requires planning, financing, and a deliberate decision to prioritize comfort and leisure over stability. Someone sat down and signed paperwork for that caravan. Someone decided it was worth the monthly payment. And that someone is now texting her child to say she cannot afford the dog's medication. So we need to sit with that for a moment, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. When someone tells you they have no money, you extend them a degree of trust. You picture empty bank accounts and hard choices and a person doing their best in a difficult situation. That instinct is not wrong. But trust has to be calibrated by evidence, and the evidence here is overwhelming. Every single time this woman says she cannot afford something, she is making a statement that has to be filtered through 15 years of documented financial choices. She cannot afford her dog's medication, but she could afford to build out her backyard. She cannot cover a vet bill, but she managed to get herself a caravan. She apparently cannot keep up with the basic costs of pet ownership, but at some point in the not very distant past, she sat down and approved a landscaping project. The money does not disappear. It just goes to different places than she would like you to think. And that distinction, between genuinely not having money and choosing not to spend it on certain things, is the entire moral core of this story. Now let us talk about the text. She did not ask directly. That is important. A direct ask can be rejected cleanly. A direct ask puts the power in your hands. Instead, she went with the implication. She said the dog needs medication. She said she cannot afford it. She left the rest hanging in the air like a hook, waiting for guilt to do the work for her. Imagine reading that message and feeling the familiar weight of it settle into your chest. Not surprise. Not even sadness. Just that old, practiced, almost automatic sense of being responsible for fixing something you did not break. This is textbook manipulation. This is what people who have spent decades extracting resources from others learn to do. They frame the situation so that your silence feels like cruelty and your refusal feels like a character flaw. She was not asking. She was constructing a scenario where saying no would make you the villain. Our narrator said nothing. Just left it on read. Sat with the notification on their phone and made the active, difficult, quiet decision to not engage. And honestly, that took strength. More strength than most people who have not lived inside this kind of dynamic will ever fully appreciate. Because here is the thing. When you have been trained from childhood to respond to this woman's distress signals, ignoring them does not feel neutral. It feels like you are doing something wrong. Your stomach tightens. Your mind starts running through justifications for why maybe this time is different, maybe this time she really is stuck, maybe you are being too hard on her. That internal negotiation is exhausting, and it is not accidental. It is the direct result of spending your formative years being taught that her discomfort is your emergency. The guilt is not rational. It is conditioned. It was installed over years of being made to feel responsible for an adult's problems when you were still a child yourself. So choosing not to respond, actively sitting with the discomfort of that silence, watching the notifications sit there and not moving, that is not a passive act. That is resistance. Then came the follow-up text. Oh, of course there was a follow-up text. When the guilt hook did not land the first time, she cast it again, this time with a different weight on the line. Your 18-year-old brother is so upset about the dog. There it is. She looped in the sibling. She made it about someone else's emotional pain, because appealing to your own feelings was not working. Think about the calculation behind that message for a second. She looked at the situation, assessed that the direct approach had failed, and then identified the next most powerful lever available to her. Not the dog's health. Not her own distress. Your brother's feelings. Because she knows that is harder to dismiss. She knows that a sibling's sadness lands differently than her own claims of hardship. This is escalation. This is what manipulation looks like when it shifts gears. She is not saying the dog is suffering. She is saying your brother is suffering. And if you do not help, you are not just letting her down. You are letting him down too. That is a much harder thing to sit with, because unlike her, he is genuinely innocent in all of this. He grew up in the same house. He did not choose this situation either. He is an 18-year-old kid who loves a dog, and he is being used, whether he knows it or not, as emotional ammunition in someone else's long-running campaign. Can we just take a second to acknowledge how exhausting it must be to live inside this dynamic? To carry the weight of someone else's choices while also trying to manage your own life, your own health, your own future? The sheer cognitive and emotional load of it does not show up in any bank statement, but it is absolutely a cost being paid. Now let us address the money question directly, because this is where people tend to get complicated. Our narrator does have savings. They are disabled, they are in university, they cannot currently work, and yet they have managed to save something. That in itself is worth pausing on. Saving money while disabled and in school, without a regular income, requires discipline and sacrifice and careful planning. Every one of those saved pounds represents a choice our narrator made to be responsible, to protect themselves, to build a small buffer against a world that is harder to navigate when your body or mind does not cooperate. They also spend money on their niece and nephew a few times a year, which the mother knows about, and which apparently serves as evidence that there is a fund available to be tapped. Here is what is important to understand. Having money and being obligated to give it to someone are two completely separate things. The existence of savings does not create a debt. The fact that you choose to spend on children you love does not mean every other person in your life gets a claim on your account. Especially not a person who spent 15 years demonstrating that she will always choose her own comfort over her responsibilities to other people. And this is where the disability piece becomes really significant. Our narrator is not working right now. They are trying to finish their education while managing a disability, which is already a full-time undertaking in ways that people without disabilities rarely have to consider. Every appointment, every accommodation, every day that the body or mind does not cooperate the way it needs to, all of it has to be navigated alongside coursework and deadlines and the ordinary stresses of adult life. That takes an enormous amount of energy, planning, and careful resource management. There are probably days when simply getting through the academic workload is a victory, when the idea of also managing finances and family guilt and the emotional labor of untangling all of this feels genuinely overwhelming. Every pound or dollar in that savings account represents security for someone who cannot just go pick up extra shifts if something goes wrong. That money is not excess. That money is a safety net. And the idea that it should be redirected to cover a vet bill for a dog owned by a woman who bought a Caravan with money she apparently did not have is actually kind of infuriating when you lay it out that plainly. There is also a deeper principle at play here, and it is one that often gets lost in these conversations about family and money and obligation. Bailing someone out does not help them. It enables them. It tells them, without words, that the system works, that the pattern is sustainable, that someone will always be there to catch the consequences before they fully land. If every time this woman faces a consequence of her own financial choices, someone steps in and absorbs the impact, she never has to reckon with the pattern. She never has to sit with the result of choosing a renovation over an emergency fund. She never has to feel the discomfort of a decision she made catching up with her, because that discomfort always gets redirected onto whoever she can reach by text. She just gets to keep making the same choices indefinitely because the people around her keep making sure the math works out. Helping her here would not be kindness. It would be participation. There is one more layer to this that deserves attention, and it is the emotional one. Because yes, there is a dog involved. And yes, dogs are innocent. They do not choose their owners and they do not deserve to suffer because of adult human dysfunction. That is real and it matters, and it is okay to feel a pang about it. Feeling something for an animal in this situation does not make you naive. It makes you human. But our narrator is not responsible for that dog. They did not ask for the dog to exist. They did not encourage the purchase or adoption of a pet by someone who demonstrably struggles to manage their finances. The dog's presence in this story is not an argument. It is a prop, placed carefully in the text of that message to make the emotional ask feel bigger and more urgent. And the fact that an animal is involved does not automatically transfer the cost of care onto the nearest person who happens to have a savings account. If the mother could not afford medication, perhaps she should not have taken on the financial responsibility of a pet. That sounds harsh, but it is the actual truth. Here is where this lands. This is not even a close call. Our narrator is not the asshole. Not even slightly. 15 years of this woman's choices have spoken loudly and clearly about where her priorities lie. The fact that she now finds herself unable to cover a vet bill is not a crisis she stumbled into. It is not bad luck. It is not the universe being unkind. It is the predictable outcome of a decade and a half of choosing Caravans over savings accounts, choosing renovations over emergency funds, choosing one day of work a week over financial security for the household. And the person responsible for managing the fallout of those choices is the person who made them. Not her disabled adult child who is trying to build a life with limited resources and hard-won savings. Saying no here is not cruelty. It is clarity. It is the recognition that love does not require you to fund the consequences of someone else's choices indefinitely. It is the understanding that you are allowed to protect yourself, that your savings account is yours, that the years of conditioning that make this feel wrong are not the same thing as it actually being wrong. It is also, frankly, the only way this woman ever has any chance of confronting the reality of her situation. She will not change if the people around her keep absorbing the cost of her decisions. The most honest thing our narrator can do, for themselves and honestly for her, is hold the line. Do not send the money. Let the silence stand. You have already given this woman more than enough. A stranger tried to push into our home over an AirTag and called the cops when we said no. He was already halfway up the stairs before anyone fully processed what was happening. One moment he was standing on the sidewalk, the next he was pushing past the doorway, and the only thing between him and the inside of their home was a woman who had every right to say no. And she did say no. And that is when things got truly unhinged. Let us set the scene properly, because context is everything here. The family is in the middle of a couch swap. Old couch out, new couch in, classic moving day chaos. The kind of day where the front door is propped open longer than it should be, where strangers walking by can see straight into your living room, where everyone inside is distracted and tired and just trying to get through the task. The dad is visiting, which means this is one of the few days there is a male presence in the house, because normally it is just the mom and her daughters living there alone. That detail is going to matter. A lot. So the front is open, there is some activity around the property, and a couple approaches claiming their cat's AirTag last pinged somewhere near this address. Fine. That happens. AirTags are a thing, cats wander, this is not inherently suspicious. The mom, being a reasonable and decent human being, says sure, go check the backyard. That is a generous and trusting response to a stranger's request. She did not have to do that. She was in the middle of something. She had her own family to manage and her own home to deal with. She did it out of goodwill, out of that quiet human instinct to help someone who seems distressed, and she extended that kindness freely and without hesitation. But these people did not look around the backyard and move on. Instead of doing the reasonable thing and checking the area they were directed to, they planted themselves next to the stairs. Right next to the entrance to the house. And they started trying to look inside. Picture what that actually looks like in practice. Two strangers, standing where they were not directed to stand, craning to see past the doorframe of someone else's home, positioning their bodies in a way that had nothing to do with finding a cat in a backyard. That shift is not innocent. That is not someone anxiously searching for a lost pet, pacing the yard, calling the cat's name, checking under bushes. That is someone who came with a different agenda than the one they stated, or at the very least someone who has a complete inability to read a social situation and respect a boundary that has not even been formally drawn yet. This is the moment where alarm bells should have been going off for everyone, and apparently they were, because our narrator came to the door to keep an eye on things. That instinct, that quiet pull toward the door, toward staying visible and present, was their gut doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Then the man said he would feel a lot better if he could check inside. Just like that. Calm, casual, like it was a perfectly reasonable request. Like entering a stranger's private home based on the last signal from a tracking device that had not updated in 20 minutes was just a standard neighborly thing to do. The family said no. They said they were not comfortable letting a stranger into their home. They said it clearly and directly, without cruelty, without aggression, but with the kind of firm and unmistakable language that should have ended the conversation on the spot. And his response to that no was to keep walking up the stairs anyway. Pause. Just pause right there. He heard the word no. He was told directly, by the people who live there, that they were not comfortable with him entering their home. He looked at that boundary, and he chose to walk through it anyway, one step at a time, as if the no had simply not registered, or worse, as if it had registered and he had decided it did not apply to him. That is not someone who is anxious about a missing cat. That is someone who has decided his desire to be inside that home outweighs the consent of the people who live there. That is an incredibly dangerous mindset, and it is one that should make every single person listening to this story feel deeply uncomfortable, because it does not matter whether his cat was in there or not. The moment a person continues advancing on a private residence after being told no, the situation has changed entirely. The cat is no longer the subject of the conversation. The boundary is. The dad had to physically push him off the porch. Physically. Think about what it takes for a situation to arrive at that point. Someone came to their door, was given access to the yard, violated that access, was told no to going further, and still had to be removed by hand from the property because he would not stop. And even then, even while being pushed back, he kept insisting that it was a normal and reasonable thing to ask. He lives down the street. He is a neighbor. It is just a quick check. Would you not do the same for someone in the neighborhood? And look, that framing is seductive if you do not think it through. Of course you would want to help a neighbor find a lost pet. Of course you would feel empathy for someone whose cat has gone missing. The image of a worried pet owner is a sympathetic one, and he was leaning into that image hard. But that empathy has a limit, and that limit is the front door of a private residence. No amount of distress, real or performed, gives a stranger the right to enter your home without your consent. That is not how any of this works. I genuinely cannot believe this man thought that was okay. I cannot. So they called the police. Which, again, is something people do when they feel their request is legitimate and they want institutional backup. Fine. The cops came. The family explained the situation. The officers listened and apparently found the family's account reasonable, because they left them alone. But here is where it gets a whole other level of calculated. While the couple was outside talking to the police, they told them that the family kept their cats locked up in cages. Now, the family had previously explained that their own cats were secured in a bedroom during the couch move so they would not escape. That is responsible pet ownership. That is exactly what you are supposed to do when your front door is going to be open for an extended period. Any careful, considerate pet owner knows that. But this couple took that completely normal and responsible piece of information and deliberately reframed it to sound sinister, feeding it to law enforcement in a way designed to create probable cause for a search. That is not someone who is just worried about their pet. That is someone who is actively trying to manipulate the legal system to gain access to a home they were denied entry to. That is a completely different category of behavior. Think about what that means for a moment. This couple came to the door, were shown goodwill, were given access to the backyard, refused to honor the limits of that access, physically tried to push into the home, were removed by force, called the police, and then lied to those police in an attempt to fabricate grounds for a search. Every single one of those steps represents an escalation. Every single one of those choices shows a willingness to use whatever tool is available, social pressure, physical persistence, law enforcement, to override this family's right to say no. That is not anxious pet ownership. That is a pattern of coercive behavior from people who were not used to hearing the word no and were not prepared to accept it. And let us talk about the AirTag itself for a second, because it is doing a lot of work in this man's argument and it probably should not be. AirTags are not GPS trackers with live real-time precision. They update when they ping off of Bluetooth devices nearby. The last update was 20 minutes old when this couple arrived. A cat can cover a significant amount of ground in 20 minutes. An AirTag that pinged near a property does not mean the cat is inside that property. It means the cat was somewhere in the vicinity of that address at some point before this confrontation even started. Using a 20-minute-old Bluetooth ping as justification for demanding entry into a private home is not logical. It is not reasonable. It is the language of someone who has already decided what they believe and is looking for tools to justify the conclusion they arrived at before they had any evidence. Here is where this lands, and it needs to be said without any softening. This family did absolutely everything right. They were generous when they did not have to be. They drew a clear and reasonable boundary when that generosity was being exploited. They held that boundary even under physical pressure, even when it was uncomfortable, even when someone was standing on their porch refusing to leave and insisting they were the problem. They cooperated with law enforcement while protecting their legal rights. And they did all of this while managing an already chaotic moving day in a household that is primarily women living alone. The fact that they are even questioning whether they should have let him in tells you exactly how effective his manipulation was, because he made them feel like the refusal was the problem rather than the escalating boundary violations. No. You do not let strangers into your home. Not for an AirTag ping. Not for a neighbor's story. Not because someone is upset or insistent or has called the police. Your home is the one place where your consent is absolute. A missing cat is a tragedy. Giving up your right to control who enters your private space is not the solution to someone else's tragedy. This couple showed you exactly who they were the moment he kept walking up those stairs after being told no. That was the answer to every question you might have about whether you should have done things differently. You said no. You were right. And no guilt trip, no police call, no story about a missing pet changes that. Trust what you felt in that moment. Your instincts were not wrong. Drop a comment below and let me know which story hit harder for you. If you made it this far, a like and subscribe would mean the world.